The summer evening of July 8, 1961, hung heavy over the Buckinghamshire countryside, the kind of sultry night that seemed to trap secrets in the warm air above the Thames Valley. At Clevedon House, the magnificent estate where Lady Nancy Astor once held court over Britain's political elite, another kind of gathering was taking place, one that would forever alter the trajectory of a nation still clinging to the last vestiges of imperial dignity. By the Baroque swimming pool, illuminated by underwater lights that cast dancing shadows on the Georgian mansion's limestone walls, a 46-year-old cabinet minister named John Profumo stood in evening dress, champagne glass in hand, surveying what appeared to be an ordinary weekend house party. The Secretary of State for War had accepted Lord Astor's invitation as a respite from the mounting pressures of the Cold War, never imagining that within minutes he would encounter a 19-year-old showgirl whose very existence would unravel not only his own career, but shake the foundations of Harold Macmillan's conservative government. Christine Keeler emerged from the cottage where she was staying with Dr. Stephen Ward, the society osteopath, whose patient list read like a who's who of British power. She moved with the unconscious grace of youth, unaware that her presence at this gathering of politicians, aristocrats, and diplomats had been orchestrated by forces far more complex than social coincidence. What none of the assembled guests knew, as they sipped their drinks and exchanged pleasantries beneath the English stars, was that Soviet military intelligence officer Captain Yevgeny Ivanov was also present that evening, his trained eyes cataloging every face, every conversation, every potential vulnerability. The stage was set for one of the 20th century's most devastating political scandals, a perfect storm of espionage, sexual intrigue, and institutional hubris that would expose the rotting foundations of Britain's establishment. Within 2 years, the ripples from this single evening would force a prime minister from office, destroy careers built over decades, drive a man to suicide, and reveal to the British public just how porous the boundaries had become between their nation's secrets and its enemies. This is the story of the Profumo affair, drawn from declassified files and public archives, a tale of how personal weakness became national vulnerability, and how the collision between private desire and public duty would forever change the relationship between Britain's rulers and the ruled. In the early 1960s, Britain stood at a crossroads between its imperial past and an uncertain future. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had brutally exposed the limitations of British power, while the Berlin Wall's construction in August 1961 served as a stark reminder that the world now belonged to two superpowers, neither of them British. Harold Macmillan's conservative government, in office since 1957, was desperately trying to maintain Britain's relevance in this new bipolar world order, clinging to the special relationship with America while simultaneously pursuing entry into the European Economic Community. The security services, MI5 and MI6, operated in this context with a mixture of arrogance and anxiety. They had weathered the devastating revelations of the Cambridge spy ring, with Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean's defection to Moscow in 1951, still fresh in institutional memory. The discovery that Kim Philby, the former head of Soviet counterintelligence operations, was himself a double agent, would not be confirmed until 1963, but suspicions had been mounting for years. This atmosphere of paranoia and wounded pride permeated every level of the intelligence community, creating a siege mentality that would prove catastrophic when faced with the moral complexities of the Profumo case. John Profumo himself embodied the contradictions of his era. Born to privilege in 1895, educated at Harrow and Oxford, he had served with distinction in both world wars and married the actress Valerie Hobson in a fairy tale ceremony that epitomized 1950s glamour. His rise through conservative ranks seemed inevitable. His appointment as Secretary of State for War in 1960, confirming his status as one of the bright young men expected to modernize the party for the challenges ahead. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay appetites and vulnerabilities that would prove impossible to reconcile with the responsibilities of high office. The doctrine governing British intelligence operations in this period was shaped by what officials termed the special relationship with the United States, a partnership that had been forged in the crucible of World War II, but was increasingly strained by Britain's declining global influence. The intelligence services were expected to punch above their weight, providing value to their American counterparts through access to sources and networks that the CIA could not easily replicate. This pressure to demonstrate continued relevance led to increasingly aggressive recruitment operations, often targeting Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers stationed in London. Captain Yevgeny Ivanov represented exactly the kind of target that MI5 desperately wanted to flip. The 45-year-old naval attaché at the Soviet embassy had arrived in London in March 1960, ostensibly to serve as a liaison between the Soviet Navy and their British counterparts. But intelligence assessments quickly identified him as an officer of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. His gregarious personality, fluent English, and apparent enthusiasm for Western culture made him an attractive candidate for recruitment, the kind of operation that could provide genuine intelligence value while demonstrating British capabilities to their American allies. The approach to Ivanov was entrusted to MI5's most unconventional asset, Dr. Stephen Ward. The osteopath's extraordinary network of contacts, spanning high society, the arts, politics, and the demi-monde, made him an ideal intermediary for sensitive operations. Ward's cottage on the Cliveden estate provided the perfect neutral ground for what intelligence professionals termed a honey trap operation, though the precise nature of his relationship with the security services remains disputed even in declassified documents. What is clear from archived records is that Ward had been providing information to MI5 since at least 1957, his unique position allowing him to observe and report on the private behaviors of some of Britain's most powerful individuals. The political pressures facing Macmillan's government in 1961 were immense. The Prime Minister had staked his reputation on Britain's application to join the European Economic Community, a move that required delicate negotiations with Charles de Gaulle's France while maintaining the special relationship with the United States. Domestically, the government faced mounting criticism over economic stagnation, rising unemployment, and a series of spy scandals that had shaken public confidence in the competence of the security services. The last thing Macmillan needed was another crisis that would expose the government to charges of weakness or incompetence. The mission, as conceived by MI5, was elegantly simple in theory, but fatally complex in execution. Ivanov would be cultivated through his friendship with Ward, gradually introduced to a wider circle of British contacts, and ultimately presented with opportunities to provide information in exchange for continued access to Western society. The operation reflected the arrogance of an intelligence service that believed it could manipulate personal relationships for strategic advantage, never considering that the targets of such manipulation might possess their own agendas, desires, and loyalties that could not be easily controlled or predicted. The tradecraft employed in the cultivation of Yevgeny Ivanov represented both the sophistication and the fundamental weaknesses of British intelligence operations. In the early 1960s, MI5's approach relied heavily on what officers termed social intelligence, the gathering of information through seemingly casual interactions in neutral settings where targets would feel comfortable enough to reveal their true thoughts and intentions. This methodology had proven effective during World War II, when British agents successfully penetrated German social circles. But the Cold War presented different challenges that required adaptation of these traditional techniques. Stephen Ward's cottage at Cliveden became the operational center for what MI5 designated as Operation Increase. Though this codename appears only in heavily redacted documents released decades later, The cottage provided several tactical advantages that made it ideal for intelligence operations. Its location on Lord Astor's estate offered both prestige and privacy, while Ward's established reputation as a bohemian host created a plausible cover for gatherings that might otherwise have attracted suspicion. The swimming pool parties, that became legendary in subsequent press coverage, were, according to intelligence assessments, carefully orchestrated events designed to create an atmosphere of relaxed intimacy, where barriers might be lowered and confidences shared. The surveillance techniques employed during this period reveal the limitations of 1960s technology and the heavy reliance on human intelligence gathering. MI5 maintained intermittent physical surveillance of both Ivanov and Ward, but budget constraints and the need for discretion meant that coverage was far from complete. Telephone intercepts were technically possible, but required ministerial authorization that could create bureaucratic complications if the operation were exposed. Instead, the service relied primarily on Ward's reporting and occasional debriefings with other participants in the social circle that surrounded the cottage. On the evening of July 8, 1961, the convergence of multiple intelligence operations created a situation that would prove impossible to control. Ward had invited Christine Keeler and her friend Mandy Rice-Davies to provide what intelligence professionals euphemistically termed appropriate companionship for Ivanov, part of an effort to make the Soviet officer feel welcomed and potentially compromise him through romantic entanglement. The presence of John Profumo at the same gathering was not part of the operational plan, but rather reflected the overlapping social networks that made such encounters both possible and dangerous. The pool party itself unfolded with an almost theatrical quality that would later fuel endless speculation about what had been planned versus what had simply happened. Keeler's decision to swim naked was later described by participants as spontaneous, but intelligence assessments suggested that such behavior was consistent with the atmosphere Ward cultivated to break down social inhibitions. Profumo's obvious attraction to the young woman was immediately apparent to other guests, including Ivanov, who possessed the trained eye of an intelligence professional capable of recognizing potential vulnerabilities. The introduction between Profumo and Keeler, facilitated by Ward in his role as host, represented a moment when personal desire intersected with national security in ways that none of the participants fully understood. Intelligence documents suggest that Ward may have recognized the potential complications of this encounter, but chose to allow events to unfold rather than intervene, possibly calculating that multiple relationships involving Keeler could provide additional leverage in the cultivation of Ivanov. This decision, if it was indeed conscious rather than merely negligent, would prove to be one of the most consequential errors in the history of British intelligence operations. The second documented encounter between Profumo and Keeler occurred at Ward's Wimpole Mews flat in London on July 15, 1961, exactly 1 week after the Cliveden party. This meeting, arranged through telephone calls that were later reconstructed from Ward's personal records, took place in what intelligence professionals term a more controlled environment, where conversations could be more easily monitored. Ward's flat had been modified with recording equipment, though the extent and purpose of this surveillance remains disputed in official records, with some sources suggesting it was installed for intelligence gathering, while others claim it was merely for Ward's personal entertainment. The flat itself reflected Ward's unique position at the intersection of multiple worlds, located in a prestigious area of central London. It contained Ward's osteopathy practice, his artist studio, and living quarters that had been designed to accommodate both professional appointments and social gatherings. The decor combined medical equipment with artwork, comfortable seating areas with examination tables, creating an environment that was simultaneously clinical and intimate. This unusual atmosphere appears to have been deliberately cultivated to put visitors at ease, while providing Ward with maximum flexibility in how he chose to interact with different categories of guests. The relationship between Profumo and Keeler, that developed over the following months represented a case study in how personal vulnerabilities could be exploited for intelligence purposes, though the question of who was exploiting whom would become central to later investigations. Profumo, despite his privileged background and political sophistication, appears to have been remarkably naive about the potential security implications of his involvement with a young woman who was simultaneously being cultivated by Soviet intelligence. His behavior during this period suggests a man intoxicated by the excitement of transgression, unable to reconcile his public responsibilities with his private desires. The operational challenges facing Men I-5 during this period were compounded by the increasingly complex web of relationships that centered on Ward's social circle. Intelligence officers found themselves trying to monitor and influence multiple simultaneous operations, each with its own objectives and risks. The cultivation of Ivanov remained the primary mission, but the service also needed to assess whether Profumo's relationship with Keeler represented a security threat, a potential asset, or simply a complication that needed to be managed. The lack of clear protocols for such situations reflected the ad hoc nature of much intelligence work during this period, when operations were often improvised rather than systematically planned. Three pivotal operations during the 18-month period, from July 1961 to December 1962, would ultimately determine the trajectory of what became known as the Profumo affair. Each operation reflected different aspects of Cold War intelligence gathering, from traditional espionage techniques to the more subtle art of political manipulation, but all were connected by the central figures whose personal relationships had become inextricably entangled with matters of national security. Operation Matchbox, conducted between August and October 1961, represented MI5's most direct attempt to recruit Yevgeny Ivanov as a British intelligence asset. The operation took its name from a technique that involved passing coded messages through seemingly innocent exchanges of matchboxes during social gatherings, a method that allowed for communication without the need for formal meetings that might attract attention from Soviet counterintelligence. Ward served as the primary conduit for these exchanges, using his position as host of regular gatherings to facilitate contact between Ivanov and MI5 handlers, who appeared to be ordinary guests. The matchboxes themselves contained microfilm with carefully selected pieces of British intelligence that were deemed valuable enough to demonstrate good faith, but not so sensitive as to compromise ongoing operations. These materials included tactical assessments of NATO exercises, personnel rosters for British military units stationed in Germany, and economic intelligence about planned defense spending that might be of interest to Soviet planners. The hope was that by providing Ivanov with information he could pass to his superiors, MI5 could establish his credibility within the GRU, while simultaneously creating a channel for controlled leaks that might reveal Soviet priorities and capabilities. The operation initially appeared successful, with Ivanov expressing enthusiasm for the arrangement and providing what seemed to be valuable intelligence about Soviet naval capabilities and GRU operational methods. However, intelligence assessments conducted years later suggest that Ivanov may have been playing a more sophisticated game, feeding British handlers information that was either outdated or deliberately misleading, while using his access to British social circles to gather genuine intelligence for his Soviet masters. The extent to which Ivanov was controlling the operation, rather than being controlled by it, would not become clear until after the public exposure of the scandal. Operation Overflow, running parallel to Matchbox, from September 1961 through March 1962, focused on the exploitation of Christine Keeler's relationships with both Profumo and Ivanov for intelligence gathering purposes. The operation's code name referred to the spillover of information that occurred when targets were emotionally compromised, and therefore more likely to reveal sensitive details during intimate conversations. MI5's handling of this operation reveals the moral ambiguity that characterized much intelligence work during this period. with officers apparently willing to exploit a young woman's personal relationships without fully considering the long-term consequences for any of the individuals involved. The intelligence gathered through Operation Overflow included details about cabinet discussions regarding nuclear weapons policy, plans for British troop deployments in response to the Berlin crisis, and assessments of American reliability as an ally that Profumo had shared during private moments with Keeler. This information was considered valuable enough to justify continued support for the operation, despite growing concerns among some MI5 officers about the security risks posed by Profumo's increasingly reckless behavior. The fact that similar information was potentially being passed to Soviet intelligence through Keeler's relationship with Ivanov created a situation of unprecedented complexity that the service struggled to manage effectively. The mechanics of Operation Overflow required Ward to serve multiple roles simultaneously as intelligence asset, facilitator, and buffer between the various parties whose interests were not always aligned. His personal relationship with Keeler appears to have been genuinely paternal, but he was also using her as an unwitting intelligence gatherer while attempting to maintain his credibility with both British and Soviet handlers. This balancing act became increasingly difficult as the emotional stakes intensified and the relationships became more complicated than intelligence professionals had anticipated. Operation Lighthouse, the final major intelligence initiative of this period, was launched in January 1962 as MI5 began to recognize that the previous operations had created as many problems as they had solved. The operation's name reflected its defensive nature, an attempt to provide early warning about potential security breaches while containing the damage from what was increasingly recognized as a compromised situation. Rather than continuing to exploit the existing relationships, Lighthouse focused on monitoring and assessment, with the goal of determining whether any genuine security breaches had occurred and what steps might be necessary to limit the potential damage. The operational parameters of Lighthouse included enhanced surveillance of all parties involved in the previous operations, detailed analysis of any intelligence that might have been compromised, and preliminary planning for damage control measures that might become necessary if the situation became public. This shift from offensive to defensive intelligence work reflected a growing recognition within MI5 that the cultivation of Ivanov had failed to produce significant benefits while creating vulnerabilities that could have strategic implications if exploited by Soviet intelligence. The outcome of Operation Lighthouse was a series of classified assessments that painted an increasingly troubling picture of security lapses and potential compromise. Intelligence officers identified at least 12 separate occasions when classified information had been discussed in circumstances where it could have been overheard by unauthorized individuals, including 6 instances where Profumo had shared details about cabinet discussions with Keeler during their private meetings. The assessments also revealed that Ivanov had been far more successful in his intelligence gathering than previously recognized, with evidence suggesting that he had obtained detailed information about British nuclear weapons policy, NATO contingency planning, and the personal vulnerabilities of senior government officials. The techniques employed in gathering intelligence about these operations reflected the intersection of traditional espionage methods with the emerging technologies of the early 1960s. MI5 made extensive use of telephone intercepts, though the quality of recordings was often poor and the legal authorization required for such surveillance created bureaucratic complications that limited its effectiveness. Physical surveillance relied heavily on human assets who could blend into the social environments where targets operated, but the small size of Ward's circle made it difficult to introduce new personnel without attracting attention. The most sophisticated aspect of these operations was the psychological profiling conducted to assess the motivations and vulnerabilities of all parties involved. MI5 psychologists developed detailed assessments of Profumo's personality, identifying his need for validation and excitement as key vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services. Similar assessments of Keeler emphasized her naivety and desire for security, while evaluations of Ivanov highlighted his professionalism and long-term strategic thinking. These profiles would later prove remarkably accurate in predicting how each individual would behave when the scandal became public, though they were less successful in anticipating the broader political consequences of the affair. The economic dimensions of the Profumo affair reveal a complex web of financial relationships that both enabled the intelligence operations and created additional vulnerabilities that would ultimately contribute to the scandal's exposure. The funding mechanisms that supported Ward's lifestyle and operations provide crucial insights into how intelligence work was conducted during this period, while the broader economic pressures facing Britain in the early 1960s created the political context that made the scandal so damaging to the Conservative government. Stephen Ward's financial situation throughout the period, from 1961 to 1963, presents a puzzle that has never been fully resolved. Even with the release of previously classified documents, his official income from osteopathy practice and portrait painting was modest, yet he maintained an expensive lifestyle that included the Wimpole Mews flat, the cottage at Cliveden, frequent entertaining and regular gifts to the young women in his circle. Bank records suggest that Ward received periodic payments from sources that were not disclosed to tax authorities, while MI5 financial records contain references to operational expenses that appear to correspond to Ward's lifestyle during the relevant period. The question of whether Ward was receiving payment for his intelligence work became central to later investigations, with different sources providing contradictory accounts of the financial arrangements. Some documents suggest that Ward was considered a patriotic volunteer who provided information without compensation, while others indicate that he received regular payments disguised as consultation fees or expense reimbursements. The truth appears to be that Ward's financial relationship with the intelligence services evolved over time, beginning as voluntary cooperation, but gradually becoming more formal as his value as an asset became apparent and his personal financial needs increased. The economic pressures facing Christine Keeler during this period were more straightforward, but equally important to understanding the dynamics of the scandal. At 19 years old, with limited education and few marketable skills beyond her physical attractiveness, Keeler was economically dependent on the men in her life, including Ward, who provided her with housing and spending money in exchange for her participation in his social circle. This economic vulnerability made her an ideal target for intelligence exploitation, as she could be motivated through relatively small financial incentives while lacking the resources or knowledge necessary to understand the full implications of her involvement. The payments that Keeler received from various sources during her relationships with Profumo and Ivanov reflect the complex motivations that drove the affair. Profumo provided her with gifts and occasional cash payments that he characterized as tokens of affection, but which could also be interpreted as payment for services rendered. Ivanov, despite his limited official income as a Soviet diplomat, also provided Keeler with gifts and money, though the source of these funds remains unclear and may have come from operational budgets controlled by Soviet intelligence. Ward's financial support for Keeler appears to have been the most consistent, suggesting that her value to his operations justified ongoing investment in maintaining her loyalty and availability. The political economy of intelligence work during this period was shaped by the competing pressures of providing value to American allies while maintaining independent British capabilities. MI5's budget had been reduced following the Suez Crisis as part of broader government spending cuts, forcing the service to rely more heavily on assets like Ward, who could provide access to valuable targets without the need for expensive infrastructure or full-time personnel. This economical approach to intelligence gathering created opportunities for private financial interests to become entangled with national security operations in ways that were not always clearly defined or carefully monitored. The prisoner exchange dimensions of Cold War intelligence work also played a role in the calculations surrounding the Profumo case. though this aspect of the story has received less attention in popular accounts of the scandal. During the early 1960s, both British and Soviet intelligence services were actively engaged in complex negotiations over the exchange of captured agents, with each side seeking to maximize the value they could extract from their human assets. The potential recruitment of Ivanov was seen as particularly valuable because Soviet naval officers were rarely available for such exchanges due to the classified nature of their work and the strategic importance of naval intelligence. The economic analysis of the scandal's impact on the conservative government reveals how personal indiscretions could have broader political consequences in an era when Britain's international credibility was already under strain. The revelation that a cabinet minister had been compromised through his relationship with a woman who was simultaneously involved with a Soviet intelligence officer raised questions about the competence of British security services and the reliability of the government's handling of classified information. These concerns were particularly damaging at a time when Britain was seeking to demonstrate its continued relevance as an ally to the United States, while simultaneously negotiating for membership in the European Economic Community. The diplomatic costs of the scandal extended beyond immediate embarrassment to include long-term damage to intelligence sharing arrangements with allied nations. American intelligence officials expressed private concerns about the security of information shared with British counterparts, while NATO allies questioned whether British personnel could be trusted with sensitive military planning documents. These concerns had practical implications for Britain's role in international defense arrangements and contributed to a broader reassessment of the country's strategic value that would continue throughout the decade. The legal frameworks governing intelligence operations during this period were deliberately vague, creating opportunities for abuse, while providing officials with plausible deniability when operations went wrong. The Official Secrets Act provided broad powers for the government to classify information and prosecute those who disclosed it, but the Act's provisions were written primarily to address traditional espionage, rather than the more complex moral and legal questions raised by operations like those surrounding the Profumo case. This legal ambiguity would become apparent during the subsequent investigations and prosecutions that followed the scandal's exposure. The turning point in what would become the Profumo affair arrived, not through the careful planning of intelligence professionals or the strategic calculations of political leaders, but through the chaotic intersection of personal jealousy, criminal violence, and press investigation that characterized much of early 1960s Britain. The catalyst that would ultimately expose the entire web of relationships centered on Stephen Ward's cottage was a shooting incident on December 14, 1962, when Antiguan jazz promoter Johnny Edgecombe fired several shots at the front door of Ward's Wimpole Mews flat in an attempt to force entry and confront Christine Keeler about her relationship with his rival, Lucky Gordon. The shooting represented the collision of two different worlds that had been carefully kept separate throughout the previous 18 months of intelligence operations. Edgecombe and Gordon moved in the milieu of London's Caribbean community, a social network that had developed around the jazz clubs and illegal gambling establishments of Notting Hill and Soho. Their relationship with Keeler had begun before her involvement with either Profumo or Ivanov, rooted in the casual sexual relationships and minor criminal activities that characterized the lives of young people on the margins of respectable society. The violence that erupted between them over Keeler's attention represented a settling of scores that had nothing to do with Cold War intelligence gathering, but everything to do with the personal dynamics that intelligence operations had failed to control. The police investigation that followed the shooting created the first significant breach in the operational security that had protected the various intelligence operations surrounding Ward's circle. Detective Chief Inspector Samuel Herbert, assigned to investigate the incident, quickly discovered that Keeler had been living at Ward's flat and was involved in relationships with several men whose identities she was reluctant to reveal. The investigation required Herbert to piece together Keeler's movements during the months leading up to the shooting, a process that inevitably led to questions about her other relationships and the source of the money that supported her lifestyle. Herbert's methodical approach to the investigation reflected the professionalism of metropolitan police detectives, but it also revealed the vulnerability of intelligence operations to routine police work. The detective had no knowledge of the secret operations that had been conducted through Ward's social circle, but his investigation uncovered evidence of relationships and financial arrangements that suggested activities beyond what was immediately apparent. The fact that Ward was evasive about his relationship with Keeler and reluctant to provide details about the men who visited his flat created suspicions that led Herbert to dig deeper into circumstances that MI5 had hoped would remain hidden. The political context that surrounded the police investigation was shaped by mounting pressures on Harold Macmillan's government from multiple directions. The rejection of Britain's application to join the European Economic Community by Charles de Gaulle in January 1963 had dealt a severe blow to the government's international credibility, while domestic economic problems and a series of spy scandals had eroded public confidence in conservative leadership. The revelation of another potential security breach involving government officials would represent exactly the kind of crisis that the government could not afford at this particular moment. The cascade of events that followed the shooting investigation demonstrates how quickly carefully constructed intelligence operations could unravel when subjected to external pressures. Herbert's questioning of Keeler about her relationship with Ward led to questions about other men she knew, which eventually led to questions about John Profumo. The detective's growing awareness that he was investigating something more significant than a simple shooting incident prompted him to brief his superiors, who in turn alerted Special Branch about the potential involvement of government officials in what appeared to be irregular circumstances. The internal fractures within the government that became apparent during this period reflect the institutional weaknesses that had developed within the Conservative Party after more than a decade in power. Macmillan's leadership style, which had served him well during the relatively stable conditions of the late 1950s, proved inadequate for managing the crisis that was developing around the Profumo case. The Prime Minister's tendency to delegate responsibility while maintaining plausible deniability about operational details left him unprepared for the kind of hands-on crisis management that the situation required. The intelligence service's response to the unfolding crisis reveals the limitations of organizations that were structured to handle external threats rather than internal political complications. MI5's primary concern was protecting ongoing operations and preventing the exposure of sources and methods, objectives that were not necessarily compatible with the government's need to contain political damage. The service's initial instinct was to minimize the significance of any security breaches while emphasizing the voluntary nature of Ward's cooperation. But this approach failed to account for the broader political implications of the revelations that were beginning to emerge. The press investigation that would ultimately expose the full scope of the scandal began in February 1963, when freelance journalist John Lewis approached several newspapers with information about relationships between government officials and women who were also involved with Soviet intelligence officers. Lewis had obtained his information through contacts in London's demi-monde, including individuals who moved in Ward's social circle and were aware of the various relationships that centered on his flat and the Cliveden cottage. The journalist's initial approaches to established newspapers were largely unsuccessful, as editors were reluctant to publish allegations that could result in expensive libel suits against prominent public figures. The breakthrough came when Lewis approached Reginald Cray, one of the notorious Cray twins who controlled much of London's organized crime during this period. Cray's interest in the story was not journalistic, but financial, as he recognized that information about the private lives of government officials could be valuable for blackmail purposes. However, Cray's involvement also created opportunities for the information to reach other sources, including journalists who were more willing to pursue controversial stories and private investigators who specialized in gathering information about public figures. The timeline of public exposure accelerated rapidly during the spring of 1963 as multiple investigation streams began to converge. The police investigation into the Edgecombe shooting was scheduled to come to trial in March, creating the possibility that Keeler's testimony would reveal details about her other relationships. Simultaneously, press investigations were uncovering additional details about Ward's activities and the various men who had been involved with Keeler. The government's attempts to manage these parallel developments through official channels proved increasingly ineffective as the scope of the revelations expanded beyond what could be contained through traditional crisis management techniques. The immediate consequences of the crisis began to unfold on March 22, 1963, when John Profumo was forced to make a personal statement to the House of Commons, denying any impropriety in his relationship with Keeler. The statement, delivered with the full weight of parliamentary protocol, was crafted to provide legal protection against libel claims, while attempting to contain the political damage from revelations that were becoming increasingly difficult to deny. However, the statement's careful wording and obvious evasiveness failed to convince either parliamentary colleagues or press investigators that the full truth had been revealed. The collapse of Profumo's position over the following weeks reflected the impossibility of maintaining official denials in the face of mounting evidence about the true nature of his relationship with Keeler. The discovery of letters that Profumo had written to Keeler provided documentary evidence that contradicted his parliamentary statement, while additional witnesses were prepared to testify about the extent of their relationship. The legal and political pressures created by these revelations made Profumo's position untenable, forcing him to choose between continued denials that could result in perjury charges or admission of deception that would end his political career. The aftermath of the Profumo affair represents one of the most thorough examinations of intelligence failures and political crisis management in modern British history, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants to reshape public expectations about government accountability and the relationship between private behavior and public responsibility. The official investigations, legal proceedings, and historical reassessments that followed the scandal provide a comprehensive record of how institutional weaknesses and personal failures could combine to create a crisis that undermined public confidence in the competence and integrity of democratic institutions. The Denning Report, published in September 1963, represented the government's most ambitious attempt to provide an authoritative account of the events while limiting the political damage to conservative leadership. Lord Denning's investigation, conducted with broad powers to compel testimony and examine classified documents, produced a 50,000-word analysis that combined detailed chronology with assessment of the security implications of the various relationships that had been exposed. The report's conclusions that no significant security breaches had occurred despite obvious lapses in judgment by government officials were widely criticized as an attempt to minimize the scandal's implications rather than provide an objective analysis of what had happened. The legal proceedings that followed the scandal's exposure reveal the complex intersection of criminal law, national security, and political accountability that characterized the British system during this period. Stephen Ward's prosecution on charges of living off the earnings of prostitution became the most controversial aspect of the entire affair, with critics arguing that he was being scapegoated to protect more powerful individuals who had been involved in the same activities. The trial itself was marked by irregularities that suggested official pressure to secure a conviction, including the apparent coaching of witnesses and the exclusion of evidence that might have supported Ward's defense. Ward's suicide, on August 3, 1963, while awaiting sentencing after his conviction, eliminated the possibility of appeals that might have revealed additional details about the intelligence operations that had centered on his activities. The circumstances of his death including the timing of his decision to take an overdose of sleeping pills and the content of the suicide notes he left behind, have been the subject of continuing speculation about whether he was murdered to prevent further revelations. While no evidence has emerged to support the most extreme conspiracy theories, the convenient timing of Ward's death, for those who preferred that certain aspects of the scandal remain hidden, has contributed to persistent questions about the official account of events. The personal reckonings that followed the scandal affected all of the major participants in different ways, reflecting the different levels of responsibility and culpability that could be assigned to their various actions. John Profumo's life, after his resignation, became a model of redemption through service, as he spent the remainder of his career working with charities in London's East End, ultimately receiving recognition for his contributions to social welfare. His marriage to Valerie Hobson survived the scandal, though both paid a significant price in terms of social ostracism and financial hardship during the immediate aftermath of the revelations. Christine Keeler's experience after the scandal demonstrates the particular vulnerabilities faced by young women who became involved in intelligence operations without fully understanding the implications of their participation. Her attempts to capitalize on her notoriety through book deals and media appearances were largely unsuccessful, as public opinion remained divided about whether she was a victim of exploitation or a willing participant in activities that had damaged national security. The criminal charges brought against her in connection with the Edgecombe case resulted in a prison sentence that further limited her opportunities for rehabilitation, while the persistent media attention made it difficult for her to establish a normal life away from the scandal. Yevgeny Ivanov's return to the Soviet Union in January 1963, before the full scope of the scandal became public, represented a successful intelligence operation from the Soviet perspective, as he had gathered valuable information about British security procedures and political vulnerabilities without suffering any significant consequences for his activities. His subsequent career in Soviet intelligence and his willingness to discuss the case in interviews after the end of the Cold War provide important insights into how the affair was perceived from the Soviet side, including confirmation that the intelligence gathered through his relationships in London had been considered valuable by his superiors. The institutional changes that followed the Profumo investigation included significant reforms to intelligence oversight and security procedures that were designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Declassified's operational methods were revised to include better coordination with other government departments and more careful assessment of the security implications of using civilian assets for intelligence gathering. The vetting procedures for government officials were strengthened to include more thorough background investigations and periodic reassessments of individuals with access to classified information. The archival materials that have been released in the decades since the scandal provide a rich source of information about the decision-making processes and institutional dynamics that shape the government's response to the crisis. The cabinet papers, intelligence reports, and personal correspondence that have been declassified reveal the extent to which senior officials were aware of the potential security implications of the relationships surrounding Ward's circle, as well as the political calculations that influenced decisions about how to manage the crisis once it became public. The museum exhibitions and educational programs that have examined the Profumo affair in subsequent decades reflect changing public attitudes about the relationship between private behavior and public responsibility, as well as evolving understanding of the role that intelligence operations played in Cold War politics. The National Archives' online resources include digitized versions of key documents from the case, while the Imperial War Museum's Cold War exhibition includes displays about intelligence operations that provide context for understanding how personal relationships became entangled with national security concerns. The legal processes that examined potential security breaches and criminal activity related to the case established important precedents for how similar cases would be handled in the future. The procedures developed for investigating allegations of security breaches, while protecting ongoing intelligence operations, became models for later investigations, while the difficulties encountered in prosecuting cases that involved both criminal activity and national security concerns highlighted the need for specialized legal frameworks that could address such complex situations. The historical reassessment of the Profumo affair that has occurred as more documents have been declassified and participants have provided their own accounts of events has revealed a more complex picture than was available to contemporary observers. The recognition that the scandal represented not just personal failings, but systemic weaknesses in how democratic institutions manage the tension between transparency and security has influenced modern approaches to intelligence, oversight, and government accountability. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about the appropriate boundaries between public and private life for government officials, as well as the ethical obligations of intelligence services when conducting operations that involve civilian personnel. The Profumo affair stands as a watershed moment in modern British history, marking the end of an era when public deference to authority could be taken for granted, and the beginning of a more skeptical relationship between citizens and their government. The scandal exposed not only the personal weaknesses of individuals in positions of power, but also the institutional failures that allowed those weaknesses to become national vulnerabilities. The collision between private desire and public responsibility that played out in the drawing rooms and swimming pools of the British establishment revealed fundamental questions about accountability, competence, and the moral authority necessary for democratic governance. The intelligence operations that provided the initial framework for the scandal represented both the sophistication and the profound limitations of Cold War espionage. The attempt to exploit personal relationships for strategic advantage reflected an understanding of human psychology that was remarkably advanced for its time, but it also demonstrated a casual disregard for the welfare of the individuals whose lives became pawns in a larger geopolitical game. The failure to anticipate or control the emotional dynamics that developed between the various participants revealed the inherent unpredictability of operations that depended on manipulating the most fundamental human needs for intimacy, validation, and security. The political consequences of the affair extended far beyond the immediate damage to Harold Macmillan's government to reshape the entire landscape of British politics. The scandal accelerated the decline of traditional conservative leadership and contributed to the social and cultural revolution that would define the remainder of the 1960s. The revelation that those who governed Britain were subject to the same appetites and weaknesses as ordinary citizens undermined the mystique of authority that had sustained the British establishment through centuries of imperial expansion and global influence. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Profumo affair lies not in its immediate political consequences, but in its demonstration of how personal stories could illuminate larger truths about power, vulnerability, and the human cost of international conflict. The young woman who swam naked in a Buckinghamshire pool on a warm summer evening became an unwitting catalyst for changes that would reshape British society, while the men who sought to use her for their own purposes found themselves exposed to scrutiny that revealed the gap between public rhetoric and private reality. In the end, the affair served as a mirror that reflected not just the weaknesses of particular individuals, but the broader contradictions of a society struggling to adapt to the demands of a new era while clinging to the comforting illusions of an imperial past that was already disappearing into history.